Hello everyone, Dr. Catalana here. The purpose of this video is to introduce you all to Learning Module 2 on pre-assessment. So I did choose to do this via screen share because I want to make sure I show you how to navigate through a couple of resources for this week. Just to recap, we just finished up on our first learning module on differentiation. So the purpose of that module is really to establish a firm foundation on the purpose of differentiation. You should be able to very clearly articulate why we differentiate for student interest, readiness, and learning preference, and provide examples of how we could do that by differentiating our learning process, the learning product, as well as the content that students are learning. Now, a really key component in terms of differentiation is figuring out that academic readiness. So as you all saw in your case study from Learning Module 1, some of those classrooms did a really good job mentioning pre-assessment. So that first classroom about a science class, looking into simple machines, that teacher grouped students in terms of academic readiness based on a pre-assessment. And the reason that's so important is we have to meet students where they are. That means appropriately challenging them and supporting them. So if we really want to successfully achieve differentiation, we have to have the right starting place. So pre-assessment is so important because it helps establish that starting place in terms of academic readiness. We cannot assume we know what students know. And also it's important that we pre-assess in our own classrooms and we don't rely on previous assessments and just assume students remember everything. Okay, so I'm going to click into your second learning module. You can see here that I have my table of contents. As I've previously mentioned, I do prefer to navigate through that way. So just quickly on your module overview, you're going to begin with reading the case study and then completing the items in the library. Now, this week, you are completing, or for this module rather, you are completing both a discussion board post and you are completing a pre-assessment interpretation activity. Now, both of these assignments are based on the case study. Okay, so it's really important that you start this learning module with a clear understanding of the case study. So the very first thing I want to walk through with you is the case study. Okay, so I'll click here on my folder and let's go to the overview of the case study. So case 2 is all about pre-assessment. It's all about forming that basis of understanding about academic readiness. So there's two different components that I provided for you in terms of this case study. So the first is the actual case, and there's some interesting student samples in there. And then I also linked this overview of the scientific method. The reason for that is the case is based on a 6th grade science class. And I wanted to provide how this 6th grade class would define the scientific method and what they are expected to know. So first things first, to my friends who are not science people, do not fret. I made sure that I provided any kind of background material that you would need to complete this. So as always, before I dig any deeper, I want to just read the question. So here's my discussion board post question. How should Sarah Jones, the gifted and talented teacher, explain why pre-assessment is essential in order to best teach the scientific method to all students, not just gifted and talented, at Riverdale Middle? So I always like to start with reading the question. It helps me kind of organize my thought process before I go into the case, and also really informs me of what to look for when I start to dig into the content for the week. Okay, so let's look at the actual pre-assessment. No. Oh, I have it pulled up. Here we go. So your pre-assessment case study. Again, this is all about a 6th grade class, and The teacher's name is Mr. Ayers. So Mr. Ayers teaches at Riverdale Middle. He's our lead science teacher. And his colleagues are always telling him sixth grade really needs to cover the scientific method. The kids aren't getting it. They really need to cover it. But Mr. Ayers is not really into this idea, mainly because he says that all of the elementary schools that feed into their middle school teach the scientific method in fifth grade. So Mr. Ayers is basically frustrated. He does not want to teach this material because students should already know it. Sarah Jones is our gifted education teacher. So she's recently taken classes on gifted ed, and she convinces the entire science team to provide a pre-assessment on the scientific method. So basically, she organizes an opportunity for all the science teachers to go to the computer lab during science class, and they create or answer a pre-assessment question that pertains to the scientific method. So here's their question that the sixth graders complete. How would you design an experiment that determines whether or not bees prefer diet or regular cola? Interesting question. And I went ahead and chose 6 students. This is the exact slide that they saw before completing that question. And these are 6 different students' responses. Okay, so you should immediately see that some students wrote a lot more than others. So this is a pre-assessment. In this class, they have yet to talk anything about the scientific method. So basically what the purpose of this is to determine how much do these kids already know. So we have 6 different students. You could see this final student, we would put a couple of drops of each soda on the flour and wait to see which one they like. This student seems to have a little bit more of a basic understanding than the second student right here. You can see they start with a hypothesis, and then they're mentioning things like a control and the procedure. Okay, so in terms of your case study, the question is, how should Sarah explain why this pre-assessment is important in order to best teach the scientific method to all of our students? Okay, so that's your case study here. Of course, before you were to go into answering that discussion board post, the main part of your work for the week is to carefully review all of these library materials. The main portion of this is why we pre-assess and how pre-assessment leads into differentiation. Particularly want to highlight these 2 sources in your readings about why we pre-assess and kind of that step-by-step. Of course, I do highly encourage you to review all of these materials. They should be all supporting each other. Okay, so let's go back to our outline just to make sure I'm being clear. I'm sorry, our overview. So that's our discussion board post. And of course, to find that discussion board post, you're down here, discussion board. The link is right there. Your initial discussion board post is due on Friday evenings, and then your responses to your discussion board posts from your classmates are due Sunday evenings. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is your module assignment, okay? So as I mentioned at the start of this video, the module assignment is a pre-assessment interpretation that is also based on those 6 students in your case study. Okay, so your challenge is to submit an interpretation of the pre-assessment data. So that is your 6 students. Assume the role of the science teacher in the case study and look at the 6 open-ended responses that your students gave. Okay, so your first question is to analyze the 6 students in terms of readiness. So based on only what you see in these responses, how academically ready are these students in terms of the scientific method? Now, you should be asking yourself a question right now. Well, what are we wanting them to know, right? It's very important that we are being clear about how we're defining the scientific method, which is why in your case study, I also included an overview of the scientific method. Yes, I'm not actually submitting. Okay, so this is the actual handout that teachers at Riverdale Middle would use as a review before testing on the scientific method. So basically, this information, I have it already pulled up here, is what students should know about the scientific method. Okay, this is actually like what students are given as a review. So it goes through and defines everything they should know. It's very student friendly. It even includes a quick little review at the bottom and some vocabulary. I'm not a huge fan of this crossword at the bottom, but I know that some teachers have used it. So this is kind of to help you see, well, what is expected of these students? And that will be essential as you are determining the academic readiness. Okay, so real quick, pre-assessment interpretation. What am I looking for? Number 1, analyze the 6 responses in terms of readiness. Make sure that you justify how you determined that, right? So was it because they mentioned all of the terms in that review document? Or did you just think one was better than the other? You need to justify why, okay? So number 1 is to analyze that readiness. Number 2, how would you group the students by academic readiness? Don't be intimidated by this. There's not a right and wrong. I just want you to tell me your thinking here. Would you have 2 groups? Would you have 3 groups? Do you think that there's just one student who's very advanced and you could kind of do some individualized learning with him or her and then teach the other 5? So that's really up to you. I just don't want you to be intimidated that I'm looking for a certain answer. I'm just looking for your description. Lastly, how and what will you teach differently for the students who demonstrate advanced readiness? Okay, so remember, pre-assessment is the start to really quality differentiation. So if you know academic readiness, I want to see you thinking through, well, how would I differentiate content? How would I differentiate product? And how would I differentiate process? Okay, so this is a definite application assignment of here's some pre-assessment data and what would you do with it. I do highly encourage you to review the associated rubric. So I would just click here. As said in the rubric, I do need to see you referring to your library resources in order to earn full credit. Okay, so just as a brief overview, in terms of learning module 2, we are extending our learning of differentiation by focusing on pre-assessment. Pre-assessment forms the foundation for really quality differentiation. We have to reliably and using a valid assessment determine where students are academically, and that helps us inform differentiation. So for this learning module, your first assignment would be the case study discussion board, and then to analyze the information in the case study through the pre-assessment interpretation activity. I really like this module because it begins challenging you to start applying the content that we've studied. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks, everyone.